Hello everyone, my name is Sapna Reddy. I'm a nature and landscape photographer based in California, and on behalf of B&H, today I'll be sharing 5 photography tips that I have found useful when trying to create a 3D effect to images and also add a dreamy, ethereal atmosphere to them. So let's get started. Tip number 1. Perhaps the most important of them all is to have the right quality of light. If we have harsh light with sharp contrast and deep shadows, then it's very difficult to render that dreamy, soft, airy, ethereal feeling. So quality of light needs to be quiet, it needs to be soft. We're talking cloudy days or periods of angled light, sunrise, sunset times. Those are the ideal conditions when it comes to dreamy atmosphere. If we don't have that and we have to artificially create it, we could try to do that by creating some sort of condensation on the lens or perhaps applying Orton Effect in post-processing, but it won't quite be the same as shooting with the right quality of light. So that quiet light is key. Tip number 2. When we're trying to create a 3D feeling to an image and convey a feeling of depth, one way to do that would be to use the wide angle and bring the foreground elements very close and large and dominant in the frame. This invites the viewer to step into the frame. But when we do that, we tend to minimize what's in the background because the wide angle lens will distort the distant visual elements and make them appear smaller than they are when we view them with the naked eye. So we need to compensate for that. So the way to do that is to shoot your foreground elements with the wide angle the way you normally would, but then use a focal length blend. So shoot the visual elements that are farther away, say they're mountains or whatever it is that you have farther away. Zoom in with your focal length, use a longer focal length and bring those mountains or whatever those background elements are into larger significance by making them appear bigger by using a longer focal length. And in doing so, you basically are rendering a scene more realistic because you're compensating for the loss of significance that happened with the wide angle. Tip number 3. To use what's called a perspective blend, where you basically shoot your foreground elements with your camera angled about 45 degrees down, right on top of the flowers or rocks or whatever it is that you're trying to make a dominant part of your foreground in the composition. And once you're done, you tilt the camera back and then you shoot the farther elements straight on. So once again, we're using the wide angle lens to distort and make something in the foreground appear bigger, but then we're going to correct that and make sure that something in the background is not hidden or obscured because you're doing that. Moving on to tip number 4. Your middle ground is extremely important when it comes to conveying that dreamy feeling, right? So we're going from the foreground into the middle ground to the background. The middle ground is where ideally we would like to have low clouds, some fog, some mist coming on, because if we don't, then it becomes sort of a negative area where the eye tends to halt, and we want the eye to flow through, have a smooth visual pathway. And so mist, fog, dodging, all of those things that you apply would be very useful if you're trying to compensate for a darker and sort of less interesting middle ground. And that brings us to the final 5th tip, and perhaps the one that is most important in post-processing, most commonly employed when it comes to creating a dreamy effect to the images, and that is the Orton Effect. One word of caution, when we do apply the Orton Effect, very important to do so preferentially to what's in the background and less to what's in the foreground, because normally our eye tends to see what's in the foreground much sharper and with contrast as opposed to what's in the background. So when you apply that Orton Effect, make sure that you preferentially apply it to the background elements. And if you have texture in the clouds, it's a great thing to soften it up. If you have no texture at all in the clouds, then please do not apply any Orton Effect at all, because then you would lose any detail that was remaining in the sky. And how do we apply the Orton Effect? Well, I use a very simple straightforward procedure that involves just a few steps. Basically, you open up the image in Photoshop and then you duplicate the layer, and then you go to the menu on top and select Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur at about 38 to 40 pixels. Apply it to the entire image. Reduce the opacity of the layer to about 16 to 17%. Once that's done, you go back to the top menu, Image, Adjustments, Levels, and just push the levels in, the ends of the levels in. Basically, you're trying to increase contrast through the image, which you have lost. So the Orton effect basically applies light and blur through the entire image. Once you have applied your Orton effect, I would say add a mask and then reduce the Orton effect in your foreground elements and in areas where you would like to retain a little bit more contrast, and it would be selectively applied to those areas that you want to look more dreamy. Hope that helps, and wish you all best of luck in going out there and capturing your own dreamy images.